Jake's horse stopped dead in the middle of Main Street, her body shaking with a terror that made his blood run cold. Somewhere beneath their feet, 12 men were suffocating in absolute darkness, and Copper was the only one who knew. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Nobody believed Jake Hollister when he first mentioned that his Colt could sense danger. In Silver Ridge, a hardscrabble mining town carved into the Montana mountains where men measured their worth in ore extracted and whiskey consumed, such talk sounded like the ramblings of a man who had spent too much time alone on the range. But Jake knew better. He had learned to trust the chestnut mare's instincts more than he trusted most people. And in the 5 years since he had gentled her from a wild-eyed yearling, she had never once led him astray. The mare's name was Copper, christened for the reddish sheen of her coat that caught fire in the afternoon sun, and for the veins of copper ore that ran through these mountains like the lifeblood of the earth itself. Jake had found her as a foal, separated from her herd during a spring storm, standing alone in a canyon with legs that trembled from cold and fear. Most men would have left her to the wolves or the weather, but Jake had always possessed a stubborn streak when it came to lost things. He had wrapped her in his oilskin coat, carried her back to his small ranch on the outskirts of town, and spent the next 3 months nursing her back to health with warm milk, soft words, and a patience that surprised even himself. From the beginning, Copper had been different. While other horses spooked at shadows and startled at sudden noises, she remained calm, almost preternaturally aware of her surroundings. But it was her reaction to genuine danger that set her apart. 3 years ago, when a rock slide had threatened to bury them both during a mountain crossing, Copper had stopped dead in her tracks a full minute before the first stones began to fall, her ears pinned back, her entire body rigid with warning. Jake had dismounted immediately, trusting her instinct, and pulled her to safety just as thousands of tons of granite crashed across the trail they would have been traveling. Since then, there had been other incidents. A grizzly bear hidden in thick brush that Copper had sensed from 50 yards away, refusing to move forward until the massive creature had lumbered off in search of easier prey. A rotted bridge over a swollen creek that appeared sound to Jake's eyes, but caused Copper to balk and paw the ground until he dismounted and tested the planks himself, discovering they would have collapsed under their combined weight. A rattlesnake coiled in the exact spot where Jake would have placed his bedroll, its presence announced by Copper's nervous stamping and head-tossing long before Jake could hear its warning buzz. The townspeople called it luck or coincidence. The more superstitious miners whispered about witchcraft or devil horses. Jake called it survival. In a territory where death lurked in collapsed mine shafts, sudden avalanches, and the countless other ways the mountains could kill a man, having a horse that could sense danger before it struck was more valuable than all the gold in the territory. Not that Jake had much gold. He made his living as a ranch hand, breaking horses for the wealthier spreads and occasionally guiding hunting parties through the high country. It was honest work that suited his solitary nature, and it allowed him to spend most of his time in the mountains with Copper, far from the noise and pretension of Silver Ridge's growing population. On this particular October evening, Jake rode into town for supplies, his saddlebags nearly empty, and his list of necessities growing longer with the approach of winter. Silver Ridge had changed considerably in the years since he had first arrived. What had begun as a scattered collection of tents and rough cabins had grown into a proper town of nearly 800 souls, complete with a main street lined with false-fronted buildings, 3 saloons, 2 churches engaged in constant competition for the miners' souls, a surprisingly well-stocked mercantile, and even a small hotel that catered to investors and mining executives from back east. The Silver Ridge Mining Company dominated the local economy, its operations sprawling across the mountainside like an industrial cancer. Dozens of shafts burrowed deep into the earth, following veins of silver and copper that had made a handful of men very rich and kept hundreds more in steady, dangerous employment. The constant rhythm of the stamp mills provided a mechanical heartbeat to the town, and the whistles that signaled shift changes had become as regular and reliable as church bells. Jake had no fondness for the mines or the men who owned them. He had seen too many miners emerge from those dark holes coughing blood, their lungs destroyed by rock dust and bad air. He had attended too many funerals for men buried alive in cave-ins, their bodies never recovered, marked only by crude wooden crosses in the town cemetery. The mountains gave up their treasures reluctantly and demanded terrible payment for every ounce of ore extracted. As he guided Copper down Main Street toward Henderson's Mercantile, Jake noticed the usual evening activity. Miners just off shift heading toward the saloons to wash the dust from their throats. Shopkeepers closing up for the night. A freight wagon unloading supplies in front of the hardware store. Sheriff Thomas Warren standing on the boardwalk outside his office talking with Doc Pritchard, the town's only physician. Jake knew both men by reputation, though he had limited interaction with either. Warren was fair-minded and competent, unusual qualities in a frontier lawman. Pritchard was skilled and dedicated, frequently working without payment to treat injured miners and their families. Jake was about to ride past when Copper suddenly stopped, her entire body going tense. Her ears swiveled forward, then back, then forward again. Her nostrils flared wide as she tested the air. The muscles in her shoulders began to quiver, that familiar trembling that Jake had learned to recognize as her response to danger. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle in his saddle scabbard as his eyes scanned the street, looking for whatever threat Copper had sensed. But everything appeared normal. No suspicious riders, no signs of trouble, just the ordinary bustle of a mining town at sunset. Yet Copper remained frozen, her attention fixed on something Jake could not see or hear. Her breathing had become rapid and shallow. Small tremors ran through her body like electricity. This was different from her usual warnings. This was not the focused alarm of a predator nearby or structural danger ahead. This was something else, something that had her confused and distressed in a way Jake had never witnessed before. Jake dismounted slowly, keeping one hand on Copper's neck, feeling the rapid pulse beneath her warm hide. Her distress was palpable, almost contagious, and he found his own heart rate increasing in response. Whatever she was sensing, it was serious enough to override her usually calm demeanor. He stroked her neck gently, speaking in the low, soothing tones that usually settled her nerves, but tonight his words had no effect. She remained rigid, her attention locked on something invisible to human senses. Sheriff Warren had noticed the commotion and was walking toward them, his boots echoing on the wooden boardwalk. Thomas Warren was a man in his early 50s, lean and weathered, with gray threading through his dark hair and eyes that had seen enough frontier violence to remain perpetually cautious. He had been sheriff of Silver Ridge for 7 years, having taken the job after the previous lawman had been killed in a dispute over a mining claim. Warren had survived this long through a combination of quick thinking, faster shooting, and an almost supernatural ability to sense when trouble was brewing. "Something wrong with your horse, Hollister?" Warren asked, his voice carrying genuine concern rather than mockery. Unlike many townspeople who dismissed Jake as an eccentric loner, the sheriff had always treated him with respect. The mare looked spooked. Jake nodded, his eyes never leaving Copper. "She's sensing something. Danger of some kind, but I can't figure what. She's been acting strange since we hit Main Street." Warren moved closer, his experienced gaze taking in Copper's trembling muscles, pinned ears, and the whites showing around her eyes. "I've heard folks talk about your horse, about how she seems to know when trouble's coming. Always figured it was mostly tall tales, but I'm looking at her now and I believe you. What exactly does she do when she senses danger?" Jake appreciated the direct question, the lack of skepticism that usually greeted any mention of Copper's abilities. "Depends on the threat. If it's immediate and close, Like a predator or structural danger, she'll stop and refuse to move forward. Won't budge an inch until the danger passes, or I find another route. But this is different. She's agitated, confused almost, like she knows something's wrong, but can't pinpoint where. Doc Pritchard had joined them now, his medical bag still in hand from whatever house call he had been making. The doctor was younger than Warren, perhaps 40, with the kind of intelligent, compassionate face that put patients at ease. He had studied medicine back east, before coming west, for reasons he rarely discussed, and his presence in Silver Ridge had saved countless lives that would have been lost to infection, injury, or the crude frontier surgery that passed for medical care in most mining camps. "How long has she been like this?" Pritchard asked, his physician's instinct for diagnosis extending even to animals. "Started about 5 minutes ago," Jake replied, "when we reached this end of Main Street. She was fine all the way in from my place, calm as could be. Then suddenly she froze up like she does when danger's near, but there's nothing I can see that would cause it." Warren and Pritchard exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. The sheriff removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Jake recognized as worry. "Hollister, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to take it seriously. Do you think your horse could be sensing danger that's not visible? Not a bear or a snake, but something happening somewhere else. Maybe underground?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications Jake was only beginning to grasp. Underground. The mines. His eyes widened as understanding dawned. "You think something's wrong in one of the mines?" Warren nodded slowly. "The evening shift went down into the Copper Queen shaft about 2 hours ago. 12 men, experienced miners, all of them. They should have sent up their first ore car 30 minutes ago, but nothing's come up. The signal bell hasn't rung. The foreman up top sent a runner to my office 20 minutes ago, but I've been trying not to assume the worst. Sometimes equipment breaks down, sometimes the signal system fails. But if your horse is reacting to something, if she really can sense danger the way you say..." His voice trailed off, but Jake understood perfectly. The Copper Queen was one of the deepest shafts in the Silver Ridge operation, extending more than 800 feet into the mountain. 12 men trapped that far underground, cut off from the surface, possibly injured or worse. The thought sent a chill through him despite the warm evening air. Copper's behavior suddenly made terrible sense. She was not sensing immediate localized danger, but something catastrophic happening in the dark depths beneath their feet. Human suffering on a scale that registered in her remarkable awareness as a wrongness in the world around her. "We need to get to that mine," Warren said, his voice taking on the sharp edge of command. "Pritchard, gather whatever medical supplies you think we'll need for multiple injuries. Hollister, I'm deputizing you right now if you're willing. I need that horse of yours to help us understand what we're dealing with." Jake did not hesitate. "I'm willing, Sheriff. Copper and I will do whatever we can to help those men." Warren was already moving, his long strides eating up the boardwalk as he headed toward his office. "I'm rounding up a rescue party. We'll need experienced miners, rope, lanterns, timber for shoring if there's been a collapse. Meet at the Copper Queen in 20 minutes. Spread the word." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of frantic activity. Jake led Copper toward the mine, letting her set the pace, watching her reactions carefully. As they moved closer to the mining district on the eastern edge of town, her agitation increased. Her steps became shorter, more reluctant, and that trembling in her muscles intensified to the point where he could feel it through the reins. Whatever disaster had befallen the trapped miners, Copper knew about it with a certainty that transcended normal animal instinct. The Copper Queen mine sat at the base of a steep hillside, its entrance marked by a sturdy timber framework and the massive wheel of the hoist mechanism that raised and lowered the cage carrying men and ore. A small crowd had already gathered, miners off shift and their families all wearing expressions of barely controlled fear. Everyone in a mining town knew that disaster could strike without warning, that the mountain could claim lives in an instant. Fathers, brothers, sons could descend into the earth in the morning and never return. Michael Brennan, the night foreman, stood beside the hoist mechanism with a face carved from granite and eyes that betrayed his terror. He was a thick-shouldered Irishman who had worked mines from Cornwall to California, a man whose experience with underground disasters made him uniquely qualified to understand exactly how dire their situation had become. When Sheriff Warren approached with Jake and the rapidly assembling rescue party, Brennan's relief was visible, though his expression remained grim. "Sheriff, thank God you're here." Brennan's voice was rough with strain. "We lost contact with the crew 2 hours ago. The signal bell went dead, no response to our whistles or shouts down the shaft. The hoist cable's intact, but when we tried to send the cage down to investigate, it only made it about 300 feet before hitting some kind of obstruction." Warren's jaw tightened. "What crew was working down there tonight?" "Patrick Murphy's team. 12 men total, all experienced. Murphy himself has been mining for 20 years, knows the Copper Queen better than anyone. If there was trouble, he would have signaled immediately, unless—" Brennan did not finish the sentence, but everyone understood. Unless the disaster had been so sudden and catastrophic that Murphy had no time to warn the surface. Jake stood slightly apart from the main group, one hand resting on Copper's neck, feeling her continued distress. The mare's behavior had become even more pronounced as they approached the mine entrance. She was pulling against the reins now, trying to move away from the shaft opening, her eyes rolling white and her breathing coming in sharp, frightened snorts. It was the strongest reaction he had ever witnessed from her, and it confirmed his worst fears about the situation underground. These men were not just in danger, they were in immediate, life-threatening peril, and time was running out. Doc Pritchard had arrived with 2 large bags of medical supplies and was organizing a triage area near the mine entrance. He worked with the calm efficiency of a man who had treated too many mining accidents, setting out bandages, splints, bottles of laudanum for pain, and the grim tools of emergency surgery that might be needed if the trapped miners had suffered crushing injuries. Several miners' wives had appeared with kettles of hot water and clean cloth, their faces pale but determined. In mining communities, everyone understood their role when disaster struck. Sheriff Warren had assembled a rescue team of 8 men, all experienced miners who had volunteered immediately despite the obvious risks. Descending into a mine where something had gone catastrophically wrong meant risking their own lives, but that calculation never entered into the decision. When men were trapped underground, you went after them. It was an unwritten law of mining communities, a code that transcended fear or common sense. Brennan was briefing the team on what little they knew. The crew had been working at the 800-foot level, extending a drift that was following a promising vein of copper ore. The last signal they had received, sent up via the bell system that connected the various levels of the mine, had been routine. Everything normal or quality good, no problems reported. Then silence. The obstruction that had stopped the hoist cage somewhere around 300 feet suggested either a cave-in or a structural collapse in the main shaft itself. If debris had filled the shaft, the trapped men would be cut off from the surface with no way to signal and, more critically, with their air supply potentially compromised. Mines were notorious for bad air, pockets of carbon dioxide or methane that could kill men in minutes. Even without such gases, 12 men in a confined space would exhaust their oxygen relatively quickly, especially if they were exerting themselves trying to dig out. Jake listened to the technical discussion, understanding perhaps a quarter of the mining terminology but grasping the essential facts. The men were trapped deep underground. The normal route down was blocked. Time was critical. And somehow his horse knew all of this with a certainty that defied rational explanation. He looked at Copper, still trembling and agitated beside him, and made a decision that felt both crazy and absolutely necessary. "Sheriff," he called out, interrupting the planning session. Warren looked up, and Jake continued. "I need to take Copper around the perimeter of the mining district. Let her react to different areas. Maybe she can help us pinpoint exactly where the trouble is, or if there's another way to reach those men." Warren considered this for a moment, his expression skeptical but not dismissive. The man had learned to trust unconventional sources of information during his years as sheriff. "Brennan, are there other entrances to the Copper Queen system?" The foreman nodded. "There's the old Shamrock shaft about a quarter-mile west. It connects to the Copper Queen at the 600-foot level, but it hasn't been used in 2 years. The timbers will be deteriorated, and there's no hoist mechanism anymore. We'd have to go down on ropes, and there's no guarantee the connecting tunnel is still passable, but it's an option if the main shaft is completely blocked." Jake was already moving, leading Copper toward the western edge of the mining property. The mare resisted at first, not wanting to move closer to the source of her distress, but his steady hand and calm voice eventually convinced her to follow. They walked slowly through the gathering darkness, past abandoned ore carts and piles of waste rock, past the skeletal remains of played-out claims and the hopeful new excavations that marked the ever-expanding search for precious metals. Copper's reactions varied as they moved. Near some areas, she calmed slightly. Near others, her agitation increased. It was not scientific or precise, but Jake trusted it more than any engineer's survey. When they reached the vicinity of the old Shamrock shaft, Copper stopped abruptly and began pawing at the ground with her front hoof. It was a behavior Jake had seen before, usually when she was trying to draw his attention to something specific. He knelt down, examining the area she was indicating, but saw nothing unusual in the dim light, just dirt and rock and the scrubby vegetation that somehow survived in the toxic soil around mining operations. Then he noticed it, a faint movement of air, barely perceptible but definitely present. A breeze was flowing from somewhere underground, carrying with it the smell of rock dust and something else, the unmistakable scent of lamp oil and human sweat. "Sheriff!" he shouted, his voice carrying across the mining district. "Over here! I think Copper's found something." Warren and the rescue team came running, lanterns bobbing in the darkness like fireflies. When they reached Jake's position, Brennan immediately understood what Copper had detected. That's an air current from below. Strong enough to feel means there's a significant opening somewhere nearby, probably connected to the old workings. The foreman was already on his knees, searching the ground with practiced hands. "Here," he said triumphantly, brushing aside dirt and vegetation to reveal a wooden cover, half-rotted and nearly invisible in the darkness. "This is an old ventilation shaft, probably dates back to the early days of the Shamrock operation." The wooden cover came away in pieces, its planks so rotted that Brennan barely had to apply pressure before they crumbled into fragments. Beneath lay a circular shaft about 3 feet in diameter, descending into absolute darkness. The air current flowing from its depths was stronger now that the cover was removed, bringing with it not just the smell of the underground, but something more ominous, the sharp tang of smoke. Warren dropped to his knees beside the opening, holding his lantern over the shaft. The light penetrated only about 20 feet before being swallowed by darkness. "Can't see bottom, but that smoke smell means there could be fire down there. If the trapped men tried to blast their way through a cave-in and hit a pocket of methane, the explosion could have started timber burning." Brennan's expression grew even more grave. Fire underground is about the worst situation possible. Burns up the oxygen, fills the tunnels with deadly smoke, and can spread through old workings faster than a man can run. If there's fire in those tunnels, those 12 men could be suffocating right now. The words galvanized the rescue team into immediate action. Two miners began rigging rope systems for descent, using the timber framework of a nearby abandoned structure as an anchor point. Others gathered lanterns, breathing masks made of wet cloth that might provide minimal protection against smoke, tools for digging and prying, and canteens of water. Doc Pritchard prepared a smaller medical kit that could be carried underground, sacrificing comprehensiveness for portability. Jake watched the preparations with growing certainty that he needed to be part of the rescue team descending into that shaft. It was not heroism that drove him, but the bone-deep conviction that Copper's abilities might be needed underground, just as much as they had been on the surface. If she could sense danger from 800 feet away, perhaps that sensing could work in reverse. Perhaps he could somehow channel her awareness, use his connection with her to navigate the dangers that waited in the darkness below. It sounded insane even in his own mind, but then again, everything about this situation defied rational explanation. "Sheriff, I'm going down with your team." Jake's voice was quiet but firm. Warren looked at him sharply. "You're not a miner, Hollister. That shaft could be unstable. There could be bad air, fire, structural collapses. I can't ask you to risk your life for men you don't even know. You're not asking, I'm volunteering." Jake moved closer to the shaft opening, feeling that same intuitive pull he always experienced when Copper was trying to communicate something important. "My horse led us to this shaft. There's a reason for that. Maybe it's because this is the right route, or maybe there's something else I'm supposed to do down there. I can't explain it better than that, but I know I need to go." Brennan studied Jake with the assessing gaze of a man who had spent his life judging whether someone had the mettle for dangerous work. "You ever been underground before?" "A few times, exploring old prospect holes and abandoned digs. Nothing like a working mine, but I'm not completely green." The foreman nodded slowly. "Can you handle tight spaces, complete darkness? The feeling of a mountain pressing down on top of you? Because if you panic down there, you endanger everyone. I won't panic, won't." Jake's voice carried absolute conviction. "I've spent weeks alone in the high country, weathered blizzards and snow caves barely big enough to turn around in, tracked wounded grizzlies into their dens. I understand fear, and I know how to work through it." Warren and Brennan exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, the sheriff nodded. "All right, Hollister, you're part of the rescue team, but you follow Brennan's orders without question. Underground, he's in command. Understood." Jake secured his hat more firmly and began checking the rope harness that one of the miners was fitting to him. The equipment was simple but effective, designed to arrest a fall but allow for controlled descent. Around him, the other members of the rescue team were making similar preparations, their faces set with the grim determination of men about to risk everything for their brothers. Thomas Garrett was among them, a coal miner from Pennsylvania, who had brought his expertise west in search of better wages. At 45, he was the oldest member of the rescue party, but his arms were still thick with muscle and his eyes sharp with intelligence. Beside him stood the Chen brothers, immigrants from China, who had started as railroad workers before finding employment in the mines. Despite the prejudice they faced in town, their courage and skill were unquestioned by those who worked alongside them underground. Young Billy Foster, barely 20, had volunteered over his mother's tearful protests. His father was among the trapped men, and nothing would keep him from attempting rescue. The rescue team assembled at the shaft opening, 7 men total, including Jake. Any more would be impossible to manage in the confined spaces they would encounter underground. Brennan would lead, followed by Garrett, then the Chen brothers, Billy Foster, another experienced miner named O'Reilly, and finally Jake bringing up the rear. Each man carried a lantern, tools, water, and breathing masks. They had perhaps 6 hours of lamp oil between them, maybe less if they had to move quickly or fight fire. It would have to be enough. Before they began the descent, Jake walked back to where Copper stood, Still trembling and agitated, but no longer trying to pull away, he placed both hands on her face, looking into her large, frightened eyes. "I need you to stay calm, girl," he said softly. "I need you to keep sensing what's happening down there. And I need to somehow feel what you're feeling. I know it sounds crazy, but we've been partners long enough that maybe there's a connection between us that goes deeper than training. If those men are going to survive, I need to trust your instincts, even when I can't see you." Copper pressed her forehead against his chest, a gesture of trust and affection she had performed countless times over the years. For a moment, Jake felt something pass between them, not words or thoughts exactly, but an understanding that transcended the normal boundaries between human and animal. She would wait for him, she would keep sensing, and somehow, impossibly, he would know what she knew. A young boy had appeared from the crowd of onlookers, the son of one of the trapped miners. He held a small wooden horse carved with the loving detail of a father with time and skill. His eyes were red from crying, but he approached Jake with the determined dignity of a child trying to be brave. "Mister, will you bring my pa back?" His voice was barely a whisper. Jake knelt down to the boy's level, meeting his eyes directly. "I'm going to do everything I can. What's your pa's name?" "Patrick Murphy. He's the foreman down there." The boy held out the carved horse. "He made this for me. Said horses are lucky. Maybe it'll help you find him." Jake accepted the carving with reverent hands, understanding the weight of trust this child was placing in him. "I'll keep it safe and bring it back to you along with your father." The boy nodded, unable to speak, then ran back to his mother, who waited with other families in the shadows beyond the lantern light. Jake tucked the wooden horse carefully into his shirt pocket, feeling its edges press against his chest like a talisman. The descent into darkness began with Brennan lowering himself over the edge of the ventilation shaft, his lantern casting wild shadows on the circular stone walls that had been carved from living rock decades earlier. The rope creaked under his weight as he disappeared into the blackness below, his voice echoing upward with terse instructions about handholds and loose rock. One by one, the rescue team followed, each man pausing at the edge to steady his breathing before committing himself to the vertical tunnel that dropped into the mountain's heart. When Jake's turn came, he gripped the rope with hands that were steadier than he had expected given the circumstances. The descent required concentration and care. The shaft walls were rough and irregular, offering occasional footholds, but also threatening to snag clothing or equipment. His lantern swung from his belt, creating disorienting patterns of light and shadow that made depth perception nearly impossible. The air grew cooler as he descended, heavy with moisture and the mineral smell of earth that had not seen sunlight in years. Above him, the circle of night sky grew smaller, then vanished entirely as he passed beneath an overhang in the shaft. The darkness was absolute and oppressive, broken only by the weak glow of lanterns from the men below. Jake found himself counting his breaths, a technique he had learned during long nights alone in the wilderness, focusing on the rhythm of inhalation and exhalation to keep panic at bay. The weight of the mountain pressed on him, not physically, but psychologically. Thousands of tons of rock surrounded him on all sides, held back only by the skill of long-dead miners and the uncertain strength of ancient timbers. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only 10 minutes, his boots touched solid ground. He was standing in a horizontal tunnel, perhaps 5 feet high and 4 feet wide, shored up with timbers that were gray with age and soft with rot. Water dripped from the ceiling in irregular patterns, creating small pools on the uneven floor. The air here was noticeably warmer and carried that smoke smell more strongly, along with something else that made Jake's stomach clench with worry: the metallic scent of blood. Brennan was consulting a crude map he had pulled from his pocket, a hand-drawn representation of the old Shamrock workings and their connection to the Copper Queen system. "We're at about 400 feet, he said, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. According to this, we need to follow this drift east for about 200 yards. Should intersect with a crosscut that leads to the main Copper Queen shaft. That's where things get tricky. If there's been a cave-in in the main shaft, we'll have to find a way around it. Thomas Garrett moved forward with his lantern, examining the timber supports with a practiced eye. These supports are in bad shape. Probably wouldn't take much to bring the whole thing down. We need to move carefully, test every step. The Chen brothers had already started forward, moving with the efficiency of men who understood that speed and caution were not opposites but complementary virtues underground. Billy Foster stayed close to Brennan, his young face pale in the lantern light but his jaw set with determination. O'Reilly, a stocky Irishman with 20 years of mining experience, brought up the middle of the group, his eyes constantly scanning for signs of instability or danger. They moved through the tunnel in single file, each man's lantern creating a small bubble of light in the overwhelming darkness. The silence was broken only by dripping water, their footsteps on wet rock, and the occasional creak of settling timbers that made everyone freeze until they were certain the mountain was not about to fall on their heads. Jake found himself reaching for that connection with Copper, trying to sense through her awareness what lay ahead. It was like grasping for a memory just out of reach, frustrating and ephemeral, but occasionally he felt something. A flutter of anxiety that seemed to come from outside himself, a directional pull that suggested rightness or wrongness about their chosen path. They had progressed about 100 yards when the tunnel ahead suddenly filled with smoke, thick and acrid, burning their throats and eyes. The rescue team immediately pulled the wet cloth masks over their faces, but the protection was minimal. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the temperature rose noticeably. "There's definitely fire somewhere ahead," Brennan said, his voice muffled by the mask. "Could be timber burning in the main shaft, or it could be in one of the side drifts. Either way, we need to find the source and assess whether we can get past it." Jake felt a sudden surge of alarm that he knew came from Copper, even though she was hundreds of feet above and beyond his sight. It was not the general anxiety she had been broadcasting since they arrived at the mine, but something specific and urgent. Without understanding how he knew, he was certain they were approaching immediate danger. "Wait," he called out, his voice sharp enough to stop the forward movement of the rescue team. "Something's wrong. Everyone freeze." Brennan turned, his expression questioning but not dismissive. "What is it?" Jake struggled to articulate what he was sensing, that impossible connection with his horse translating into human intuition. "The floor ahead. I think it's unstable. There might be a shaft or an old working beneath it, something that could collapse if we put weight on it." It was Thomas Garrett who moved forward carefully with his lantern, examining the tunnel floor with the intense focus of a man who had survived multiple cave-ins by trusting his instincts. After a moment, he began tapping the rock with the handle of his pickaxe, listening to the sounds it produced. The hollow ring of empty space beneath stone was distinctive and terrifying. "Holy Mother of God," Garrett breathed, looking back at Jake with something like awe. "There's a void under here, probably an old stope that was never properly filled. Another 10 feet and we would have broken through, fallen God knows how far into darkness." "How did you know?" Jake could not explain it in terms that would make sense, so he settled for partial truth. "My horse has keen senses. I've learned to trust her warnings even when I don't understand them fully. Seems like that trust extends even when I can't see or hear her." The rescue team spent 20 minutes carefully navigating around the unstable floor section, pressing themselves against the tunnel wall where the rock seemed more solid. Every step was tested before weight was committed, every handhold checked twice. The smoke continued to thicken as they progressed, making breathing difficult despite the wet masks, and the heat increased until sweat poured down their faces and soaked through their shirts. Jake could feel Copper's anxiety pulsing through that strange connection between them, a wordless urgency that translated into his own heightened awareness of their surroundings. When they finally reached the intersection with the crosscut tunnel, Brennan consulted his map again, though the smoke made it difficult to see clearly. According to this, the main Copper Queen shaft should be about 50 yards north through this passage. That's where the cave-in likely occurred, blocking the main route down. But there might be another way. The old-timers who worked this mountain usually dug multiple routes to the same area, insurance against exactly this kind of situation. The Chen brothers had moved ahead, their lanterns disappearing into the smoke-filled darkness of the crosscut. After a moment, the younger brother returned, speaking rapidly in accented English. Main tunnel ahead blocked completely. Big collapse, maybe recent. But side passage to west smaller looks clear. Might connect to lower levels. Brennan nodded decisively. We'll try the western passage. Stay close and keep alert. This smoke's getting worse, which means the fire's somewhere nearby. If we hit flames, or if the air gets too bad to breathe, we turn back immediately. No heroics. Dead rescuers don't help anyone. The western passage was indeed smaller, forcing them to move in a half-crouch that made progress slow and exhausting. The timbers here were in even worse condition, some actually smoldering from the heat that permeated this section of the mine. Jake could see small flames licking at one support beam, feeding on wood that had been seasoned by decades of slow drying. The sight was terrifying in its implications. If the fire spread to the main support timbers, this entire section could collapse, burying them all. Billy Foster stumbled, his hand clutching at the wall for support. His breathing had become labored, harsh gasps that spoke of lungs struggling against smoke and fear. Garrett immediately moved to support the young man, checking his eyes in the lantern light. "You're all right, boy. Just breathe slow and steady. Your pa's counting on you to keep it together." The words seemed to strengthen Foster, and he nodded, wiping his streaming eyes and forcing himself to continue. The passage descended steeply, the floor slick with water that seemed to be flowing from somewhere below. The sound of dripping had intensified into a steady stream, water running in rivulets along the tunnel walls. O'Reilly paused to taste it, then spat. Fresh water, not mine seepage, means there's probably a natural spring or underground stream nearby. Could be useful if we need to fight fire. They had been underground for nearly 45 minutes when Jake felt something change in his connection with Copper. The constant background anxiety that had been flowing from her suddenly shifted, becoming more focused and intense. But mixed with the alarm was something else, a sense of direction, of rightness about their current path. He stopped, closing his eyes and trying to strengthen that tenuous link, to understand what she was trying to communicate across hundreds of feet of solid rock. "We're getting close," he said quietly. "The trapped men are near. I can feel it." Brennan looked at him sharply. "You sure about that? Because if you're wrong and we waste time going the wrong direction, those men could die." "I'm sure," Jake replied, and he was. The certainty came not from logic or evidence, but from something deeper, that bond with Copper that had been forged over 5 years of shared survival and mutual trust. They're below us, and to the east. Not far now. The rescue team pressed forward with renewed urgency, the exhaustion and fear momentarily forgotten in the hope that they might actually reach the trapped miners in time. The passage began to widen slightly, opening into what had once been a small working chamber, where ore had been extracted and sorted. Mining equipment lay scattered about, rusted and abandoned, relics of earlier prospecting efforts. The smoke was somewhat less thick here, and they could lower their masks briefly to draw fuller breaths. Then they heard it, faint but unmistakable. The sound of metal striking rock, the rhythmic pattern of men digging. It came from somewhere below and to their left, muffled by intervening rock but definitely present. Brennan's face split into the first smile Jake had seen since this ordeal began. They're alive and they're working to free themselves. That's Patrick Murphy for you, never gives up. The Chen brothers were already searching the chamber for any opening that might lead downward. The elder brother found it, a narrow vertical shaft partially concealed behind a rock fall that looked recent. This goes down maybe 30, 40 feet. 30. Very narrow, but a man could squeeze through if he's not too big. Jake looked at the opening and felt his stomach clench. It was perhaps 2 feet wide at its widest point, barely enough for a man to fit through. And after the initial descent, visible in their lantern light, it appeared to angle sharply, potentially making it impossible to retreat back up if something went wrong below. This was the kind of space that could trap a man, leave him wedged helplessly while air ran out and darkness pressed in from all sides. Brennan was already assessing the situation with the cold practicality of an experienced miner. We need someone small enough to fit through that opening, strong enough to handle the climb, and level-headed enough not to panic if things get tight. He looked around at his team, his gaze settling on Billy Foster and Jake. "You two are the smallest. Who wants to volunteer?" Before Foster could respond, Jake stepped forward. "I'll go. I'm lighter than Billy, and I've got Copper helping guide me somehow. If anyone can make it through that shaft without getting stuck or lost, it's me." Brennan studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, Hollister. You're our rabbit. We'll lower you on rope as far as we can, but once that shaft angles, you'll be on your own. Take 1 lantern, a canteen, and this." He handed Jake a small metal whistle. 3 blasts means you've found them and they're alive. 2 blasts means you need immediate help. 1 long blast means you're trapped and we need to dig you out. "Understood." Jake secured the rope around his waist with knots that Brennan checked twice before nodding approval. He attached the lantern to his belt where it would have the least chance of breaking or getting snagged, tucked the whistle into his shirt pocket beside the carved wooden horse, and positioned himself at the edge of the vertical shaft. Looking down into that narrow darkness, he felt a moment of pure terror, the kind that threatened to freeze him in place and prevent any forward movement. Then he thought of Copper waiting above, of young Murphy's tear-stained face, of 12 men trapped somewhere below who were depending on strangers to save them. The descent began with controlled movement, his back pressed against one wall of the shaft while his feet found purchase on the opposite side. The technique was called chimneying, a climbing method he had used occasionally in narrow rock canyons, but never in complete darkness, with smoke burning his eyes and the weight of a mountain pressing down from above. The rope played out slowly as Brennan and Garrett managed it from above, providing some measure of security but also creating drag that made movement more difficult. His lantern swung wildly, throwing shadows that seemed alive and malevolent. After perhaps 20 feet, the shaft began to angle as the Chen brother had warned, transitioning from vertical to diagonal in a way that forced Jake to shift his entire approach. He could no longer use the chimney technique and instead had to squeeze through on his stomach, pulling himself forward with his hands while pushing with his toes. The rock pressed against him from all sides, a suffocating embrace that made breathing difficult and movement agonizing. Panic clawed at the edges of his mind, whispering that he was trapped, that he would die here in this narrow stone throat, that no one would ever recover his body. Then he felt it, that pulse of reassurance from Copper, as clear as if she had touched his face with her soft nose. She was with him somehow, her awareness flowing through whatever mysterious connection bound them together. The panic receded, not disappearing entirely, but becoming manageable, controllable. He focused on moving forward, 1 painful inch at a time, ignoring the scrapes on his elbows and knees, the places where the rock caught at his clothing and threatened to hold him fast. The lantern scraped along beneath him, its flame flickering dangerously, but somehow staying lit. The rope went taut, having reached its full extension, and Jake realized he was now completely on his own. No safety line, no way to signal the team above except by backtracking through this hellish passage. The thought should have terrified him, but instead it brought a strange clarity. This was the moment when survival depended entirely on his own skill and determination, the kind of situation where a man discovered what he was truly made of. He kept moving forward, following that sense of rightness that came from Copper, trusting her instincts to guide him through the darkness. The angled shaft continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only another 15 feet. Then suddenly it opened, and Jake found himself able to sit upright in a space large enough to turn around in. He brought the lantern up, and in its flickering light saw that he was in a small natural cavern, the kind of geological formation that miners sometimes encountered when their tunnels intersected with ancient water-carved spaces in the mountain. The air here was noticeably better, cooler and cleaner, suggesting some kind of ventilation to the surface. And he could hear the sound of digging much more clearly now, accompanied by voices, men calling to each other in the methodical way of crews working against time. A narrow opening on the far side of the cavern showed light, the faint glow of lamps from the trapped miner's position. Jake crawled toward it, his heart pounding with hope and fear. The opening required him to squeeze through on his side, but it was mercifully short, only about 6 feet long. When he emerged on the other side, he found himself looking down into a drift where 12 exhausted, dirt-covered men were working to clear a massive rock fall that blocked their escape route. Patrick Murphy saw him first, the foreman's weathered face registering shock and then overwhelming relief. His voice carried across the drift, hoarse but strong. "Sweet Jesus, someone got through. Boys, we're getting out of here." The trapped miners stopped working and turned toward Jake, their faces gaunt with exhaustion and fear, but suddenly alive with hope. They were in surprisingly good condition, considering their ordeal. No obvious major injuries, though several showed signs of minor wounds, and all were suffering from smoke inhalation and dehydration. Their lamps were burning low, maybe an hour of light left at most, and the air in their confined space was thick and stale despite the ventilation from the natural cavern Jake had just traversed. Jake pulled out the whistle and blew 3 sharp blasts, the signal that the miners were alive and located. The sound echoed through the tunnels, carrying back to the rescue team and, he hoped, eventually to the surface where families waited in agonizing uncertainty. Murphy was already climbing toward Jake's position, moving with the careful efficiency of a man who had spent his life underground. "You came through that crack in the wall?" Murphy gestured toward the opening Jake had emerged from. "We noticed it earlier but figured it was too small and didn't go anywhere useful." "How many men you got with you?" "7, counting me," Jake replied. "More waiting at the surface with equipment and medical supplies. What's your situation here?" Murphy's expression grew grim as he assessed their circumstances. "Cave-in happened about 3 hours ago, brought down maybe 50 tons of rock and cut us off from the main shaft. We've been trying to dig through, but the rock's unstable. Every time we move one boulder, 2 more shift into place. We're making progress, but it's slow, and we're running out of lamp oil and breathable air." 2 of the men are injured, nothing life-threatening yet, but they need medical attention soon. "Can your men make it through that passage I came through?" "It's tight and it angles upward, but I think most could manage it." Murphy looked back at his crew, calculating. "The smaller men, yes. Jimmy Chen there and young O'Brien, they'll fit fine. But Tom Bradley, he's a big man, shoulders like an ox. He might not make it through. And Frank Morrison took a rock to the leg when the roof came down. He can barely walk, much less climb through a narrow shaft." Jake felt his stomach sink. He had found the trapped miners, yes, but finding them and saving them were 2 different challenges. If some of the men could not fit through the escape route he had discovered, then they would need to either widen that passage or clear the main rock fall, both of which would take time they might not have. Jake studied the trapped miners with a growing sense of urgency. Patrick Murphy was right about the challenges they faced. Tom Bradley was indeed massive, easily 6'4", with shoulders that would never squeeze through the narrow passages Jake had just traversed. Frank Morrison sat against the tunnel wall, his left leg splinted with timber scraps and clearly causing him significant pain. The other 10 men appeared mobile, though exhausted and breathing with difficulty in the increasingly stale air. Murphy's lamp flickered and dimmed as its oil supply reached critical levels, a reminder that time was their most precious and dwindling resource. "We need to send the mobile men through first," Jake said, his mind working through the logistics. "Get them to safety, then figure out how to extract Bradley and Morrison. Murphy, can your men make the climb?" Murphy turned to address his crew, his voice carrying the calm authority that had kept them working productively instead of panicking during their hours of entrapment. "Listen up, boys. We've got an escape route, but it's tight and it's vertical in places. Who feels strong enough to make the climb?" 7 hands went up immediately, men desperate for fresh air and freedom willing to face any challenge to reach the surface. Murphy nodded approvingly. "Jimmy Chen, you go first. You're smallest and quickest. O'Brien, Sullivan, Martinez, you 3 follow. Then Jackson and Wells. I'll go last of the mobile group, help Morrison and Bradley from this end while the rescue team figures out how to get them through." The evacuation began with Jimmy Chen, a slight man in his 30s who moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years working in confined spaces. Jake guided him to the opening, explaining the route and the techniques needed for the difficult sections. Chen disappeared into the passage, his lamp creating a moving glow that faded as he progressed toward the natural cavern and the angled shaft beyond. The waiting was agonizing, punctuated only by the sounds of Chen's progress and the increasingly labored breathing of the men remaining in the trapped drift. After 15 minutes that felt like hours, they heard 3 whistles from above, the signal that Chen had successfully reached the rescue team. Relief washed through the group, and the next 3 men began their ascent with renewed confidence. Jake positioned himself at the opening, offering encouragement and guidance as each miner disappeared into the darkness. O'Brien got stuck briefly in the angled section, his shoulders wedging against the rock in a moment of pure terror, before he managed to twist himself free and continue upward. Sullivan moved through quickly, his slight frame and rock-climbing experience making him ideally suited for the challenge. Martinez paused halfway through to vomit from smoke inhalation and exhaustion, but managed to keep moving after purging his stomach. While the evacuation continued, Jake knelt beside Frank Morrison to assess his injury. The miner's leg was badly broken, probably in multiple places based on the swelling and discoloration visible even in the dim light. Moving him through the narrow passages would be excruciating and might cause additional damage, but leaving him here was not an option. Morrison's face was pale with pain and blood loss, his breathing shallow, and Jake recognized the signs of a man approaching the limits of his endurance. "How you holding up, Frank?" Jake asked gently. Morrison managed a weak smile. "Been better, won't lie to you. But I've been worse too. Broke my back in a mining accident 10 years ago. Doctors said I'd never walk again. Here I am, still working, still breathing. I'll make it through this." Tom Bradley presented a different challenge. The big man was uninjured, but his size made the narrow passage potentially impossible. He sat quietly, his expression resigned to whatever fate awaited him. Jake studied Bradley carefully, remembering how he had gotten through tight spaces in the past, thinking about angles and positioning and the surprising flexibility the human body could achieve when survival demanded it. Then he felt something from Copper, not alarm this time, but a kind of directional sense, a suggestion that there might be another way. Jake turned slowly, letting that intuition guide his attention around the trapped drift, and his eyes settled on a pile of rubble in the far corner that he had initially dismissed as just more rock from the main cave-in. Murphy noticed his focus and moved closer. "What are you seeing?" Jake approached the rubble pile, examining it more carefully in the lantern light. "This rock looks different from the cave-in material. It's older, weathered differently. I think this might be covering another passage, something that was deliberately sealed off years ago. Why would miners seal a passage? Murphy's experience provided the answer immediately. Safety concerns, usually. Maybe they hit unstable ground or bad air. Could also be they were sealing off a section that had played out, consolidating their operations. Either way, if there's a passage behind this rockfall, it might be large enough for Bradley to use, assuming it goes somewhere useful and isn't filled with poison gas or ready to collapse. It was a desperate hope based on nothing more than intuition and the inexplicable guidance Jake was receiving from his horse hundreds of feet above. But desperate situations called for desperate measures, and the alternative was attempting to force Bradley through a passage that might kill him or leaving him behind to suffocate when their air ran out. Murphy made the decision quickly. "Jackson, Wells, when you reach the surface, tell Brennan we might have found an alternate route for Bradley. We're going to start clearing this rubble carefully, see what's behind it. Jake, you help me move rock while we wait for the rest of the mobile crew to evacuate." They worked carefully, mindful that disturbing the rubble could trigger another collapse. Each stone was tested before being moved, placed deliberately in areas where it would not create instability. The physical labor was exhausting in the thin air, and both men were soon breathing in harsh gasps, their muscles screaming with fatigue. But as they cleared away the outer layer of rock, Jake's lantern revealed what he had hoped to find: the edge of a timber framework, the unmistakable sign of a deliberately constructed entrance that had been sealed deliberately rather than collapsed accidentally. The timber framework they uncovered was old but remarkably intact, preserved by the dry conditions within the sealed section. Murphy ran his hands over the wood, testing its strength and examining the construction methods. This is quality work, probably from the original Shamrock operation 20, maybe 25 years ago. They knew what they were doing when they built this. The fact that it's still solid suggests whatever's behind here might be stable. But we won't know until we break through. Jake felt another pulse from copper, stronger this time, a sense of rightness mixed with urgency that told him they were on the correct path but needed to move quickly. The last of the mobile miners, Wells, was just disappearing into the escape passage, which meant Jackson would soon reach the surface and relay their situation to Brennan. Help would be coming, but it would take time for the rescue team to navigate back through the narrow passages with additional equipment. Time that Frank Morrison, growing paler by the minute, might not have. Murphy had found a pickaxe among the abandoned equipment in the drift, and he began working on the sealed entrance with careful, measured strikes. Too much force might trigger a collapse, but too little would mean they would never break through before their air ran out. Jake joined him with a pry bar, working to loosen rocks that Murphy's strikes had fractured. The physical labor was brutal in the thin air, and both men were soon gasping, taking frequent breaks to let their burning lungs recover. Behind them, Tom Bradley sat with Frank Morrison, talking quietly to keep the injured man conscious and focused. After 30 minutes of exhausting work, they had created an opening large enough to shine a lantern through. Murphy peered into the darkness beyond, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "It's a drift. Runs north-south from what I can see. Timbers look decent, no visible cave-ins. Hair smells stale but not deadly. I think we can chance it. Jake, being smaller and fresher, you go through first, check it out. If it looks passable, we'll widen this opening enough to get Bradley and Morrison through." Jake squeezed through the gap they had created, feeling the rough edges of broken rock catching at his clothes. On the other side, he stood in a drift that was noticeably larger than the one he had just left, perhaps 6 feet wide and 7 feet high, spacious by mining standards. His lantern revealed a passage that extended in both directions, disappearing into darkness after about 50 feet. The timbers supporting the ceiling were weathered but solid, showing none of the rot or fire damage they had encountered in other sections. Most promising of all, he could feel a faint movement of air, a breeze too subtle to be called wind, but definitely present, suggesting this passage connected to the surface through some route. He followed that air current northward, moving quickly but carefully, testing the floor ahead of him for instability. The drift continued for perhaps 100 yards, gradually ascending, and Jake felt his spirits lifting with each step. This was their salvation, a route large enough for even Tom Bradley to navigate, potentially leading all the way to the surface, or at least to a section of the mine where the rescue team could reach them more easily. Then he rounded a corner and stopped dead, his heart sinking at what the lantern revealed. The passage was blocked by a massive timber door, reinforced with iron straps and secured with a heavy padlock that had rusted solid over the decades. Whatever lay beyond that door, the miners who had sealed this section had been determined to keep people out, or perhaps to keep something in. The thought sent a chill through Jake despite the warmth of the underground air. Mines had their share of superstitions and ghost stories, tales of spirits trapped in collapsed sections or of cursed tunnels where men heard voices in the darkness. Jake had never put much stock in such stories, but standing alone in the abandoned drift with his lantern casting shadows that seemed to move independently, he understood how such legends could take root in a miner's imagination. He returned to the sealed entrance and reported his findings to Murphy. The foreman's expression grew thoughtful as he considered their options. A locked door means someone wanted to keep that section isolated. Could be for safety reasons, could be they were hiding something, or could be pure superstition. But whatever the reason, we need to get through it. Bradley, you feel strong enough to swing a sledgehammer? The big man stood, stretching muscles that had been cramped from hours of sitting. I've been breaking rock my whole life, Patrick. One more door isn't going to stop me now. They widened the opening enough for Bradley to squeeze through, a process that required removing several more rocks and took another precious 20 minutes. Then Bradley, Murphy, and Jake made their way to the locked door, while Morrison waited behind, his condition deteriorating but his spirit unbroken. Bradley's first swing with the sledgehammer sent shock waves through the ancient lock, but the mechanism held. The second swing cracked the metal hasp. The third swing shattered it completely, and the door swung inward with a groan of protest from hinges that had not moved in decades. Beyond lay another drift, this one showing signs of more recent activity. Mining equipment, relatively modern, was scattered about. Support timbers were in good condition. And most startling of all, there were lanterns, already lit, hanging from hooks along the walls. Someone's been here recently, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. Within the last few hours, I'd say. Those lamps haven't been burning long. Murphy's face had gone pale. This section was supposed to be completely abandoned, sealed off after some kind of accident in the early days. Nobody should be working down here. Which means either we're not as trapped as we thought, or there's something else going on in these mines that management hasn't been telling anyone about. They pressed forward cautiously, following the lit lanterns like breadcrumbs through the darkness. The drift opened into a large chamber, and what Jake saw there made him understand immediately why this section had been sealed and why someone had been working here in secret. The chamber walls gleamed with exposed ore, not silver or copper, but gold, thick veins of it running through the rock like lightning frozen in stone. This was a gold strike of extraordinary richness, the kind that could make men wealthy beyond imagination or get them killed for trying to claim it. The implications of the gold strike hit Murphy like a physical blow. This is why the cave-in happened. Someone triggered it deliberately, trying to cover up this illegal operation, or maybe trying to eliminate witnesses who got too close to discovering it. My crew wasn't trapped by accident. We were trapped because we were working too near this sealed section, might have broken through and discovered what was happening here. Jake felt anger rising in his chest, hot and fierce. You're saying someone deliberately caused a collapse that could have killed 12 men, all to protect a secret gold operation? Murphy's expression was grim. "Mining's a brutal business, Hollister. Men have killed for far less than what's in this chamber. Whoever's running this operation has been stealing from the Silver Ridge Mining Company for who knows how long, extracting gold while reporting only copper and silver. That's a hanging offense if caught, which means they'd do anything to protect their secret." The sound of voices echoing through the passage behind them interrupted their conversation. Brennan and the rescue team had made it through, bringing medical supplies, additional lanterns, and most importantly, fresh air and hope. The foreman took in the gold-rich chamber with a single glance, and Jake saw understanding dawn on his weathered face. "So that's what this has been about. We've been sitting on a fortune and someone's been mining it right under our noses." There would be time later to unravel the conspiracy, to identify who had orchestrated the illegal operation and the attempted murder of Murphy's crew. Right now, the priority was getting Frank Morrison to safety before his injuries became fatal. Doc Pritchard had come down with the rescue team, his medical bag in hand, and he immediately went to work on Morrison. The injured miner needed proper surgery and rest, but Pritchard's field treatment stabilized him enough for transport. They rigged a makeshift stretcher from timber and canvas, and 6 men took turns carrying Morrison through the passages that led eventually to the surface. The route through the sealed section proved to be their salvation. It connected to an older part of the Shamrock operation that had a partially functional hoist system. With some quick repairs and jury rigging, Brennan got the hoist working well enough to bring Morrison up first, followed by the rest of the rescue team and the remaining trapped miners. Tom Bradley rode the hoist cage with tears streaming down his face, overcome with the simple joy of survival. Patrick Murphy was the last to ascend, pausing at the cage entrance to look back at the passages that had nearly become his tomb. When Jake finally emerged into the night air, he was met with a wall of sound. Cheers, prayers, weeping, the chaotic symphony of a community that had been holding its collective breath for hours. Families rushed forward to embrace their men, children crying with relief, wives clutching husbands they had feared were lost forever. Young Murphy broke through the crowd and ran to his father, launching himself into Patrick's arms with such force that the big man staggered backward, laughing and crying simultaneously. Jake felt a familiar presence and turned to find Copper pushing through the crowd toward him, her reins trailing loose because someone had clearly failed to secure her properly in their excitement. She pressed her face against his chest, trembling now not with fear, but with relief, that same mysterious connection between them pulsing with contentment. He wrapped his arms around her neck, breathing in the familiar smell of horse and hay and prairie wind, feeling the solid reality of her presence anchor him after hours in the suffocating darkness underground. Sheriff Warren approached, his expression a mixture of gratitude and grim determination. "Hollister, we owe you and that remarkable horse of yours a debt we can never fully repay. Every one of those men made it out alive because you trusted her instincts." Jake shook his head. "It wasn't just Copper, and it wasn't just me. It was Brennan's experience, the Chen brothers' courage, Murphy's leadership, every person who refused to give up. We all saved those men together." Warren nodded but pressed a leather pouch into Jake's hands. "The mining company is offering a reward for the rescue. More importantly, they're going to want your help investigating this gold operation. Someone high up in the company has to be involved for this to have gone unnoticed so long." The investigation that followed would eventually expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Silver Ridge society. 3 mining executives were arrested, several more fled the territory, and the illegal gold operation was shut down permanently. The trapped miners, hailed as heroes for surviving their ordeal and exposing the corruption, received compensation that changed their lives. Patrick Murphy was promoted to mine superintendent, a position he used to implement new safety protocols that would save countless lives in the years to come. Frank Morrison recovered from his injuries, though he walked with a permanent limp that he wore like a badge of honor. As for Jake, He found himself something of a local legend. The cowboy whose horse could sense danger even through hundreds of feet of solid rock. He deflected the attention as much as possible, uncomfortable with fame and eager to return to his simple life on the range. But the town's gratitude manifested in practical ways. His ranch received help with improvements he could never have afforded on his own. His services as a guide and horse trainer were suddenly in high demand. And most surprisingly, he found himself welcomed into a community that had previously kept him at arm's length. 6 months after the rescue, Jake sat on his porch watching the sun set over the mountains while Copper grazed peacefully in the pasture. Young Murphy, now nearly 10, came riding up on a new pony his father had bought with his compensation money. The boy dismounted and approached shyly, holding out the carved wooden horse Jake had carried underground. "Pa says you should keep this as a reminder, but I made you something new." He pulled from his pocket another carving, this one depicting a horse and a man standing together, crude but full of heart. Jake accepted it with hands that were suddenly unsteady. "This is beautiful work. You've got your father's gift for crafting." The boy beamed with pride, then grew more serious. "Pa says Copper saved all our lives that night. Says she's special. More than just a regular horse." Jake looked out at Copper, who had lifted her head and was watching them with those intelligent eyes that had guided him through darkness and danger. "She is special. But the really special thing isn't what she can sense. It's that she cares enough to warn us, to try and keep us safe even when we're too stubborn or stupid to listen. That's not magic or mystery. That's love." As the boy rode away, Jake reflected on how much had changed since that October night, when Copper had frozen in the middle of Main Street, sensing disaster hundreds of feet below the earth. 12 men were alive who might have died. A corrupt operation had been exposed and dismantled. A community had been reminded that courage came in many forms, including a chestnut mare who could somehow sense danger and a cowboy who had learned to trust her completely. The mountains still held their dangers, the mines still claimed lives, and the frontier remained an unforgiving place. But on this evening, with Copper grazing peacefully and the rescued miners safe with their families, Jake allowed himself to believe that sometimes, against all odds and logic, everything could work out exactly as it should.